Daf Yomi, Tracking Menachos, page 101b. Rabbi Shimon Omer, it's about a line into it. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kulan in metamin tumas oichlin. Umoide Rabbi Shimon bebasu becholov. Shemetamin tumas oichlin, hoyelo voiseloi shasa koishel. Rabbi Shimon says none of them are susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, since they are all items from which it is prohibited to derive benefit, and they therefore are not considered food. And Rabbi Shimon concedes with regard to meat cooked together with milk that it is susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, since it, meaning both the meat and the milk, had a time that it was fit for consumption before it was rendered forbidden. Yomer Avasi, Yomer Rabbi Yochanan, my time with Rabbi Shimon, Mikol ha'ochel asher ya'achel, ochel she'az yachol le'achilo le'acherim. Karoi ochel, ochel she'i ata yachol le'achilo le'acherim, eno karoi ochel. And Ravasi said that Rabbi Yochanan said, what is the reason for Rabbi Shimon's opinion that an item from which it is prohibited to derive benefit is not susceptible to impurity of food? It is because it is stated, all food which may be eaten, ha'ochel asher yachel, on that on which water comes, shall be impure. Leviticus 11:34. The redundancy in the phrase food which may be eaten indicates that specifically food that you are able to feed to others, in this case Gentiles, is termed food for the purposes of susceptibility to the impurity of food. But food that you are not able to feed to others is not termed food. Therefore, items from which it is prohibited to derive benefit and which it is therefore prohibited to feed to others are not considered food in this context. Rabbi Yehoshua explains how this can be applied to pigul. A meal offering that one rendered pigul is also food that you are not able to feed to others, as it is prohibited to derive benefit from it. Consequently, it is not susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, according to Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara asks, if so, why doesn't he also derive that meat cooked in milk is susceptible to impurity, because it is food that you may feed to others, as Rabbi Shimon maintains that it is permitted to derive benefit from meat and milk cooked together. The Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, Bas v'chalav asu v'achilo motar b'hano, shenemar, ki am kadosh ata el Hashem Elokecha, lo tevash v'kedi v'chalev v'omer, halanu Omer, Yan shekoidish tiyun li basa b'sodet trefe lo techelu. Ma lehalan asu v'achilo motar b'hano, as it is taught in Braita, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says the name of Rabbi Shimon. With regard to meat cooked in milk, eating it is prohibited and deriving benefit from it is prohibited, as it is stated, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk, Deuteronomy 14:21. And elsewhere the verse states, and you shall be holy men to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by animals in the field, Exodus 22:30. Just as there, with regard to an animal torn by animals, which is forbidden as a treifa, meaning an animal possessing a wound that will cause it to die within 12 months, eating it is prohibited, but deriving benefit from it is permitted. So to here, with regard to meat cooked in milk, where being a holy people is also mentioned, eating it is forbidden, but deriving benefit from it is permitted. Chada ve'od kamar Chada do'echashata yachal achilo le'acherem hu ve'od לדדי נמי היסלו שעשה כהישל The Gemara answers the Braita that cites Rabbi Shimon's opinion states one reason why meat cooked in milk is susceptible to impurity, and adds another. One reason is that it is food that you can feed to others. Therefore, it is called food for the purpose of being susceptible to impurity. And another reason is that even for him, meaning a Jew, although it is currently prohibited to eat the milk and meat, it had a time when it was fit to be eaten, meaning before they were cooked together. Therefore, they remain susceptible to impurity. Yesh noisa shu mitame tumas oichelin. Yesh noisa she'ena mitame tumas oichelin. The Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua from a Braita. Rabbi Shimon says that there is a case of the leftover of an offering that is susceptible to ritual impurity of food, but there is also a case of the leftover of an offering that is not susceptible to the impurity of food. Ketzad, how so? Lan lifnei zrika enu mitame tumas oichelin. How so? If it was left overnight before the sprinkling of the blood on the altar, it is not susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, as it never became fit for consumption. But if it was left overnight after the sprinkling of the blood, it is susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, since from after the sprinkling of the blood until it was left overnight, it was fit for consumption. The Braita continues, and with regard to pigul, both in cases of offerings of the most sacred order as well as in cases of offerings of lesser sanctity, the meat of the offering is not susceptible to the impurity of food. This is because it was rendered forbidden for consumption at the beginning of the sacrificial rite, and it was never fit for consumption. If the priest rendered a meal offering pigul, it is susceptible to the impurity of food, since it did have a period of time when it was acceptable, meaning when it was still flour before it was consecrated as a meal offering. This ruling contradicts Rabbi Yehoshua's understanding that according to Rabbi Shimon, a meal offering that became pigul is not susceptible to the impurity of food. Loi kashia kan shehoiselo shasa koishel kan shelo hoiselo shasa koishel. For answers, it's not difficult. As here, the Braita of Rabbi Shimon ruled that the meal offering that became pigul is susceptible to the impurity of food. It is referring to a case where it had a time in which it was fit for consumption. There, where it is not susceptible to the impurity of food, it is referring to a case where it did not have time in which it was fit for consumption. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances where it did not have a time in which it was fit for consumption? Before the flour was consecrated as a meal offering, it was certainly permitted for consumption. The Gemara answers that this could occur when he consecrated the wheat while it was still attached to the ground and was therefore not yet susceptible to impurity. Once harvested, it was already prohibited for consumption. The Gemara raises a difficulty. The flour may still have a time in which it was fit. Let him redeem it before it is placed in a service vessel. Why is it regarded as not having a time in which it was fit for consumption? The Gemara qualifies the question. This distinction between flour that came from wheat that was consecrated before it was harvested and wheat or flour that was consecrated at a later point works out well according to this version of that which Rabbi Yehoshua said: impure meal offerings and libations that have not been consecrated in a service vessel are redeemed. If they are pure, they are not redeemed. Accordingly, it works out well that the flour does not have a time in which it was fit for consumption when it came from wheat that was consecrated before being harvested. It could not be redeemed and made fit for consumption. Ella lahach lishna diamarafilu But according to this version of what Rabbi Yehoshua said, even pure meal offerings and libations are redeemed. There remains the possibility of letting him redeem the meal offering while it is pure and before it is consecrated in a service vessel. Therefore, it should be considered as having a time in which it is fit for consumption. Hashda, the Gemara answers, in any event, now he has not redeemed it, therefore it is not considered to have a time in which it was fit for consumption. The Gemara asks, how can the flour be considered as not having a time in which it is fit for consumption merely because he has not redeemed it, even though he could have redeemed it? Since in a case where, if he wants, he may redeem it, don't we attribute to Rabbi Shimon that he said that for any item that stands to be redeemed, it is as if it is already redeemed? Tanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Paramit Mitama, Tumas Oichlin, Hoil, Hoisel, Shasa Koishel. Piamanish Logish, Omer Haya, Rabbi Shimon, Para, Nivdet al Gav Merachta. The Gemara cites a source for this assertion, as it is taught in a pride that Rabbi Shimon says, a red heifer, even if it has been slaughtered, and it is therefore prohibited to derive benefit from it, it is susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, since it had a time in which it was fit. And Rish Lakish said, explaining how it is possible to derive from this halacha that any item that could be redeemed is considered as though it had been redeemed. Rabbi Shimon would say that a red heifer is redeemed with money, even when it has already been slaughtered and placed upon its pyre in preparation for being burned. If so, a meal offering that could be redeemed should also be considered fit for consumption, as is considered as though it has been redeemed. And the Gemara answers, how can these cases be comparable? Granted, with regard to red heifer, it is considered, red heifer is 878. It is considered to be an item that stands to be redeemed, since if he found another animal choicer than it, there is a mitzvah to redeem the first one and purchase the choicer one with money. But is there a mitzvah to redeem these meal offerings? The Gemara challenges, but there's a case where the sacrificial meat remained overnight before the sprinkling of the blood occurred, where there was a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood the day before, and if he had wanted, he could have sprinkled it, and the offering would not have been disqualified. And yet, Rabbi Shimon teaches in the Bride that the sacrificial meat that remained overnight is not susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, even though it should have been considered fit for consumption on the day the offering was slaughtered, as the blood stood to be sprinkled, and there was a mitzvah to sprinkle it. The Gemara answers, here we are dealing with a case where there was not sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood, as the offering was slaughtered close to sunset. Therefore the blood did not stand to be sprinkled, and the meat was therefore never fit for consumption. Aval hoisiro shehus veyom. My metamitu esechlin. The Gemara asks, but in a case where the offering was slaughtered when there was sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood, what would then be the halacha according to Rabbi Shimon? Would meat left overnight be susceptible to the ritual impurity of food? Aditani lan, nachas zikim metamitu esechlin. Liflag b'didei, b'medav mamuim, shelo hoisilo yeshus beyoim, aval hoisilo yeshus beyoim, meitamitu esechlin. If so, rather than Rabbi Shimon teaching the following, sacrificial meat that was left overnight before the blood was sprinkled is not susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, but if left overnight after the sprinkling of the blood is susceptible to the ritual impurity of food, instead let him distinguish within the case itself. In what case is this statement said? When is sacrificial meat left overnight without the blood of the offering having been sprinkled, not susceptible to the ritual purity of food? It is in a case where there was not sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood. But if there was sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood, it is susceptible to the ritual purity of food. Hachanami kamar lan kodem shire lezrika ena metamet mezaychlin la'achar shire lezrika metamet mezaychlin. The Gemara answers that is indeed what he is saying in the Braita, that if the offering was left overnight before it was available for sprinkling, meaning if it was slaughtered so late in the day that there was no time left to sprinkle the blood, it is not susceptible to the ritual purity of food. By contrast, if it was left overnight after it was available for sprinkling, meaning there was still time to sprinkle the blood, then it is susceptible to the ritual purity of food. The Gemara asks, does Rabbi Shimon in fact hold that an item that stands to be redeemed is treated as though it had already been redeemed, and is therefore considered to have a time in which it is fit, even if it was never actually redeemed? But isn't it so that when one renders either offerings of the most sacred order or offerings of lesser sanctity pigul, there was a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood once the offering was slaughtered?